All right, class, welcome back to another lecture. We are going to talk about Britain Rising today. This has to do with the rise of the British Empire and their colonization of North America. So we're going to hit not every single of the 13 colonies, but we're going to talk about representative examples of each colony or each type of colony and a couple other odds and ends thrown in there. I hope you're doing well and keeping up with these lectures. So think about at this point the sort of, not the end so to speak, but the beginning of Britain's rise to power, and then the beginning of Spain's lessening in power, and of course France will be in there too. These other countries we're not going to talk about too much, but we will just when they connect back to the people we're talking about, just as they connect back to the colonists or Britain or some such thing. So if you're wondering why, that's why. They're just not as important as these things are. So we're kind of narrowed our focus to the British at this point as we go on. So first of all, we want to take a look at what's going on in England after that 1500 magic mark. Remember, we talked about Henry VIII and how he created a church, the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. Well, I don't remember if I mentioned it in that lecture or not, but the irony of all that is he was trying to get a son. He never did have a son that lasted on the throne, and it ends up being one of his daughters, Elizabeth, who's called Elizabeth I. You can see on the screen that she reigned from 1558 to 1603. She reigned a very long time. She is one of Britain's greatest monarchs. So all of that effort that Henry put into trying to have a son on the throne never paid off, but instead we get one of Britain's greatest monarchs. So kind of funny how history plays out sometimes. So she is known as the Virgin Queen. There are some great films out there that kind of give you some idea of what things were like. I always encourage you to watch films that have something to do with history. They're not historically accurate usually, but they do give you a feeling of what things were like. They give you the ambiance. They give you big picture kind of ideas. Oftentimes the details are either obscured or they're made different so that they play to an audience. Again, if it's a movie, they got to get you and hook you and let you ride the roller coaster for 2 hours, and then they got to let you off. So movies, television shows, they're not the best way to consume history. They're an easy way, but they're not the best way. But again, I encourage you to watch movies that have some element of history in them, because they help you get a sense of what was going on. So there's a couple of movies, one called Elizabeth, and I believe the sequel is called Elizabeth, the Golden Age, or the Golden Year, something like that. And they're both really good, and you'll get a real feel for how things went in England during that period of time. One of the principal characters in the story of England during this period of time is Walter Raleigh. So if you're from Carolinas or Virginia, that Raleigh name is big because he's one of the original people who, not personally, but who funded and participated in exploration and colonization in this region. So what really happens is these new leaders, they're not knights anymore, right? They're not wearing armor, and they're not necessarily living in a castle. Some of them still are, but they're more like businessmen. They're still nobility, they're still gentlemen, but now they're business managers, and they manage all this property, and they manage these imports and exports and things like that. And they're of course very wealthy. And Raleigh's one of those new generations of these kinds of guys, and what he wants to do is colonize North America. Now remember, in previous lecture we talked about the Treaty of Tordesillas and how that gave Spain control over all of the Americas. The challenge for Spain is it's huge, and they just can't physically do anything with all of it. They don't physically control much of it. And here's England trying to make a name for itself, and Elizabeth's going to be very good at making England big and powerful and great. They're looking at North America, which is just, kind of a hop, skip, and a jump to the west from England. And they know that other than Florida, If Spain's not really doing anything there. So they're going to take a chance here and do some colonization. So the reason that area is named Virginia is because Raleigh and others named it after the Queen. This is a very common thing done with colonies, is they're named after or some connection to whoever the current leader is. So Raleigh named it Virginia after Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen. And what Raleigh would do and others would do is they would create a company, a business out of this. So you might think of colonization as a national kind of concept. It's really more of a British concept, especially a business concept, especially at the beginning. And so just like today, if you buy stock in a company, let's say it's Apple or Amazon, or you might want to buy stock in toilet paper companies right now. But if you do that, you buy the stock and you expect that stock to grow. You expect the value of that stock to increase. So that's what's happening here. So Raleigh and others would go and they would ask people to invest. So they might go to Queen Elizabeth and say, hey, if you invest in this thing, there's going to be the potential to generate more taxes. And she'll say, I like that. They might go to the church and say, if you invest in this thing, there's a potential to add more people to the church, add more people to the faith. And they say, hey, we like that idea. If you go to various businessmen, again, there's going to be avenues for them to make profit. And again, profit's not an evil thing. It's not a bad thing. In fact, it's a good thing. Now, not everyone goes about it in a good way, but profit's good, usually for everyone. And so that's what they're trying to do. Now, at first, the Queen and the government have to be kind of judicious with this. They can't be openly supporting this because technically all of the land belongs to Spain. But very soon, England's going to be powerful enough to kind of defend her own claims over there militarily, so it won't matter anymore. And again, we'll see the rise of England and the beginning of the decline of Spain. And so in order to recruit potential people to invest and later potential people to go over there, this document called the Discourse on Western Planting was created. And it's not about planting crops, it's about planting colonies. And it's kind of like, especially when they're recruiting people to actually go over there, it's kind of like a travel brochure. I don't know if you've ever experienced this, where you look at a travel brochure and you go, oh, I would like to go to the Bahamas. And then you book a trip and you go, and it's not quite as nice as the travel brochure made it sound. I'm pretty sure all of you have probably rented a hotel online, and you have all the pictures of the hotel, and the hotel looks pretty nice. And then you get there and you're like, ew, this is not at all what it was like. So that's kind of what happens to a lot of the colonists, unfortunately, is they get duped, they get tricked. But it does generate a lot of people investing in these ventures. They're very expensive. You know, England's 3,000 miles away or so from America. They've never done anything like this before, so it's a pretty big deal. So let's talk about the lost colony, the Roanoke colony. Now, I want to stop here for a second and just remind you that I'm giving you all these dates on all these lectures, but I don't require you to memorize any of these dates. So when you have the exam in a couple of weeks, 3 weeks, whenever it is, you don't have to worry about what happened in 1585 or something like that. Now, I give you dates so you can place things in your mental timeline so you know how they fit. But the reality is, if you want to know when something happened, you just look it up on your phone and Google it or whatever search engine you use. So we're talking about how things fit together, why they fit together, why things happened, who was involved, rather than just memorizing dates. That being said, the dates are helpful to know when stuff took place. And Roanoke is called the Lost Colony because it basically disappeared and no one knows exactly what happened. You may have heard of this, especially if you're from that area. You can see on the map it's actually in North Carolina now. All this used to be this sort of Virginia territory back in the original early days here. But what happens here in the timeline is in 1585 they're going to drop just over 100 people on this island, men, and this little island inside the barrier there, and they're gonna try to make it, try to make a living, try to make something. They are totally unprepared for what they need to do. They're told to make money, right? The investors are gonna expect something to happen where they make money, so they're gonna think about vineyards and maybe hopefully they'll find gold or something like that. None of that stuff's going to pan out. And in fact, that original group returns home the following year with Francis Drake, who's one of the great sea captains in British history. And they just hate it so much. A bunch of them die. They have trouble with the natives in the region. And so they just come back to England, and this thing fizzles out. So in 1587, so it kind of goes seasonally. It's almost like traffic. Goes one way part of the year, then it comes back the other part of the year. It's simpler to travel that way, especially in this early period. So they wait, they reset, they resupply, they send a new group of people in 1587, and this time it's a bunch of families. And sort of the British thinking is, well, people, if they have their families there, they'll work harder to stay there and to take care of everything. And that's pretty much how the British are going to do things from now on. They're just going to kind of move in and take over wherever they go. Other countries like Spain and France don't really do it that way. They just kind of move in enough people to control it, and then they try to suck the life out of it and bring it back to their countries. England's a little bit different. In our next lecture, we'll talk about how their whole system works. Well, they drop the people off in 87. The expectation is they'll be back the following year. Every year they'll bring in new supplies and some new people and some new ideas, but they don't get back for 3 years because in the meantime, England's in a war with Spain and France, the Anglo-Spanish War. Not to be confused with the Spanish-American War or a million other wars. But the big point for our interest here is 1588 and this thing called the Spanish Armada, where the Spanish and the French create this gigantic fleet in 1588, and they're going to invade England to bring England under control. I don't know. You know that England, France, Spain, and everybody, they're fighting with each other constantly over this, that, or the other. Well, it just so happens in 1588 that there's a lot of bad weather. The British are feeling it, and they're defending their home shores, and that always gives you extra motivation. And they actually win. The British, again, with the combination of bad weather and their own expert seamanship and their own high morale, even their insanity. I mean, they would set their own ships on fire and they would sail them right into the formations of the Spanish and French fleets. And a sailing vessel, especially one with gunpowder loaded aboard, fires the worst thing that can happen. And they end up sinking lots of ships, killing thousands of Spanish and French troops, and they never do invade England. And that's the point where you kind of see England beginning to rise and Spain beginning to fall. France is going to try to stay there with England, but they can't over the long term. And so because of that war, because of that event, because of the war, they don't actually get back to Roanoke for 3 years. And when they do, they find out it's completely abandoned. There's a fort there. It's been fortified, but there's no one there. It doesn't look like they just died in place. They're just gone. It doesn't look like they got destroyed. Everything's in one piece. So they don't ever find out what happened to them. Now, there's some thought today, based on DNA and archaeology, that they just moved onto the mainland and kind of absorbed into some of the native tribes. That was probably way more common than you would think. The natives, and this is a point that I probably should make somewhere sooner in the lecture, but the natives and the Europeans do not think alike. They may learn to speak the same language, they may use the same words, but they don't think the same way. It's sort of like men and women trying to communicate, right? If you're married, you know what I'm talking about. The point there is that they're very foreign to one another, very alien, and so it's hard for us to imagine a tribe of natives just absorbing whoever into it. But that's how they operated. They fought constantly among themselves, the different tribes. They would take prisoners. Those prisoners would eventually become part of the tribe. That's how they replenished the DNA, the gene pool, and their numbers. This is very common. And that worked the same way with Europeans, with Africans, with anybody that they ran across. As long as you follow their rules, you're one of the tribe. And so you will start to see African and European, physical characteristics cropping up into the natives. And so as time passes, that happens more and more and more. many people in America, of course, can claim some level of native blood. Probably not enough to mean anything, census-wise or money-wise as far as the casino money, but you can claim it depending on where your people are from. In any case, probably what happened is they just moved. They got tired of living on this little island and they moved to the mainland and they just absorbed it. It's also possible they were picked up by the French or the Spanish. I mean, again, it's even possible that aliens abducted them, right? There is a great book out there. You might have seen the movie called Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. It's a terrible movie. It's fun, don't get me wrong, but it's a terrible movie. But the book it's based on, Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, is actually really, really good. And I won't give the whole book away because the movie's totally different than the book, except that it has Lincoln and he's fighting vampires. But he says in the very beginning that the colony at Roanoke were eaten by vampires, and that's why they disappeared. Who knows? Again, common thought now is they just moved and absorbed into the native tribes. You can see here, though, that's not too far from what will become the Jamestown colony, and that's what we're going to talk about next. So here's a little painting of what Jamestown might have looked like back in the early days. This would be after some little bit of prosperity. This is probably 20, 30 years after the original. You can kind of see that triangle-shaped structure on the corner there. That's the original fort. They've excavated a lot of that, and it's been many years since I've been to that part of the country, but you can go to Jamestown and they've kind of restored parts of it. It's pretty neat. But you can see in this picture, they've grown out of that, and they've got some crops planted and some farms going on. So this is probably 2 or 3 decades later, at least, when this is going on. When you watch the film, and I can't remember the name of the first one, but it's not Rebels, it's the one before that. When you watch that, this is kind of where they start. The very first documentary you need to watch, it's kind of where they start with them showing up at Jamestown, actually with John Rolfe showing up. So again, quite a few years later after the establishment. So yeah, I would say Jamestown's the first, real British colony in America, because Roanoke didn't succeed. Jamestown and all these other ones we're going to talk about will succeed and will ultimately become the United States of America. So let's talk Jamestown for a few minutes. So here's a picture of Pocahontas. I bet you've seen the cartoon. And, again, it's Disney cartoon. They're all great. And, of course, they Disneyfy their thing, and you met everything. You met a lot of the characters that historically were there, but this is a movie, and especially with cartoons, they're just not accurate. So don't even take anything from the cartoon and think that's actually what happened. Now, the people who land here, they have early challenges, okay? A lot of the challenges are related to disease and climate and things like that. So we've talked about disease before, where disease hammers the native population, and those are diseases that the Europeans bring with them. So this doesn't stop once the British show up. It continues to happen. But there are diseases you get based on climate. In this area, it's things like dysentery and malaria or yellow fever sometimes. And those are all very difficult to deal with. If you get both of them at the same time, it's usually fatal. And the death rate early on, something like 50%. It's high, super high. But they're not telling everybody that back in England, right? They're still saying, hey, it's great. If you move over here, you're going to have land and you're going to be able to survive and it's going to be wonderful, except it's not. It's really kind of a swamp and it's not very nice. Again, this was, 400 years ago, right? And so they had a lot of those kind of challenges. Other challenges were the people that went didn't know what they were doing, and so they had trouble getting things off the ground. They didn't bring the right supplies. They have the wrong idea about how things should be, much like in Roanoke. Again, it's about vineyards and some way to make money, more than about trying to build a community and some kind of a stable way to survive. They also have challenges, of course, with the natives. A lot of that's misunderstanding, miscommunication. Remember, they learn each other's language, but they don't think the same way. When you talk about property, the natives see property one way, the British another. A great example of that is the natives think the British are crazy for, quote, buying land and then chopping all the trees down and then putting a fence around it and then growing crops there. That's not how the natives do things, and they think that's strange. So there's a lot of things that go on with that. So a lot of the early challenges are based on the fact that they just don't know what they're doing and they have trouble communicating. Now, about Pocahontas and John Smith, they're both real people. In the cartoon, John Smith is young and blonde and handsome, and he sounds like Mel Gibson, and Pocahontas is this beautiful young Indian woman. Well, this is a painting, probably a little liberty taken with it, but it is a beautiful woman. But she's dressed up in English clothes. She did travel to England. The reality is she was very, very young when John Smith was there. John Smith was a mercenary who was actually probably in his 40s. The pictures I've seen, he has a big red, gray, bushy beard. He looks kind of like a northern barbarian. And he goes there and probably did not have any kind of relationship with Pocahontas, and all of that stuff's pretty much made up by John Smith. But what John Smith was brought in to do was to kind of bring the colony in line because people weren't succeeding. And so he's kind of known to be a taskmaster. So he's put in charge of the colony. He goes there and he says, if you don't work, you won't eat. If you don't cooperate, we won't cooperate with you. You know, you need to follow the rules. He writes back to England, stop sending me these knights, he called them, but he didn't want gentlemen. He wanted regular guys who could work, who knew how to work. It's not that gentlemen weren't smart. They were educated. They were smart. They weren't used to working that much. But there were a lot of these rich kids coming because this was an opportunity for them to make a name for themselves, to get land. And so John Smith kind of works there for 2 or 3 years and kind of keeps things from blowing up, but they never really thrive until a guy named John Rolfe shows up. And this is where your first video starts. John Rolfe shows up, and he brings tobacco with him, and he plants tobacco in an equivalent of a garden, and he makes like $1 million equivalently in a garden of tobacco, and all of a sudden everyone else starts growing tobacco, and now we've created the first cash crop in America, which is tobacco, which that region, it just so happens where Jamestown is, we call it the Chesapeake Bay, that bay in there. And that whole region is absolutely perfect for growing tobacco. We still grow huge amounts of it there today in 2020. So Rolfe actually is the one who marries Pocahontas, and they have children. Unfortunately, Pocahontas does die on one of her trips to England because, again, she's a native woman. She can't handle all of that filth and so on that's associated with being in a city. Let's talk about politics for a few minutes. And this will be true for most of the colonies. There'll be some variation of this. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each colony with this, but most of the colonies are going to have a governor appointed by the crown or parliament, and they're going to have some kind of local assembly made up of people from the colony. And this is important to remember. This idea of assembly and it being populated by men, sorry ladies, but men who are living and working in that region. All right. And we call that direct representation. And so those two are going to be at odds sometimes. And in the next lecture, we'll talk about how the whole empire works, because there's a parliament and a government in England that tells everybody what to do. But locally, being 3,000 miles away, between the governor and these assemblies, they manage to handle most of the business of these colonies. And this is, again, basically true for all of them, even ones elsewhere in the world that the English have. Now, what really brings most of the people here is what's called indentured servitude. It's not slavery. It's a legal contract that you enter into willingly. You basically sell your services for a period of time, and then at the end of that time, you're released from those services, and then you're usually given some reward. And in America, that's called the head right system. And it has to do with the idea that if you sign on as an indentured servant, you're going to get at the end of that 5 years or 7 years or 10 years, whatever deal you signed, you're going to get 50 acres of land for yourself. And that incentive is going to bring hundreds of thousands of British people to the Americas, primarily to the South, which Jamestown or Virginia is a representation of all of the other southern colonies. They're all going to operate this way. This is going to bring all these people, and they're going to work on these plantations, mostly growing tobacco, but later on might be other things. But at the end of that, you get your 50 acres. Now, remember, the death rate's 50%. So if you die at 50%, or if you die, after a year or two or three into the process, I mean, that's too bad. If I'm the guy who owns the 10,000 acres, see, this is how it works. The wealthy people are going to go over there, and they're going to get hold of these really large tracts of land, right? 5,000 acres, 10,000 acres, whatever. I'm just using those numbers for example. And so you'll have these big tracts of land, and then I'll need bodies to do that. We'll talk about slavery in a minute. Slavery does exist, but it's very, very small in numbers at this point early on. But instead, what I'll do is I'll recruit thousands of people to work for me on my property. And again, you'll sign a deal. Let's say it's 7 years. And you'll have a place to live, and you'll get fed and all those things. You'll work for me for some specified period every day or however long a week, whatever the case is. And at the end of that, you'll get your 50 acres. Again, if you die, oh well, I'll bring more people in next year. It's kind of callous, I know, but that's the math of it. If you survive, great. At the end of that period, you get 50 acres. That's yours. You get to build a home on it. You get to plant whatever crops you want. And of course, you have to pay taxes on it, right? And this is a huge incentive to bring huge amounts of people to, again, mostly the southern colonies. And again, it's a legal binding document that has responsibilities on both sides. It's a very common thing. It's been done throughout history in the world. You can even read about it in the Bible, where Jacob, goes into indentured servitude to marry Rachel, and he gets Leah instead, and it's a whole, kind of a weird situation. Well, he does that. He signs an indentured servitude contract, basically. So it's not new. Very common. And this then creates these huge plantations. One thing you need to think about, though, is let's say you survive and you serve out your time, and now you've got 50 acres. Are you ever going to be able to compete with me, who owns 10,000 acres? There's no way. And that's going to create some friction and some problems we call class warfare. And that sort of is where slavery connects into all this. So it is true that there were slaves brought to Jamestown in the beginning. There were also free people from Africa. There will always be free African, or at least African descended people in America, even during this whole period of slavery. But what happens is, during this period of time, there's so much unrest as things progress. There will be way more of these small farmers with 50 or 100 acres than there will be these big farmers like me, right? Remember, I'm always the rich guy and you're always the poor guy in these things. So let's say there's thousands of small poor farmers and there's just a handful of rich farmers. We don't have the same agenda anymore. Who controls the government? The rich farmers. Who sits in the assembly? The rich farmers. You may get to vote if you own land and you're a man, but we still control everything. So that's class warfare. We have difference of opinion. And Bacon's Rebellion, which comes in the 1670s, is a little later than this period we're in, but it illustrates the kind of thing that happens. And that is, Nathaniel Bacon is one of many of these smaller farmers, and he doesn't like how things are going, and he wants to change. He also wants more land. This is very common for farmers. Farmers all kind of think the same way, and that is, if I'm not making enough money, I should probably get more land, and therefore I can make more money. And to some degree, that's true. And this is a kind of a common way farmers think, because there's a rule of thumb that says farmers are always in debt. Doesn't matter how big or small they are. Anyway, Nathaniel Bacon and a bunch of his buddies want to take land from the Indians, but the governor of Jamestown won't give them permission because they don't want any more trouble with the natives. Well, Bacon does it anyway, and there's a kind of a rebellion, and Jamestown ends up getting burned down. They attack the Indians all over the place. They create a huge amount of turmoil. Eventually, Bacon dies, and the whole thing kind of settles down. But the leadership of that area sort of takes off from that and says, well, we got a problem. And they then really start pushing the racial part of the slavery. All right. Now, slaves are generally coming from Africa at this time because the Portuguese got control of Africa from the Pope. Remember, about 100 years earlier. And slavery, again, like indentured servitude, has been around forever. This is not to make slavery out to be something good, but it is normal at this point in history. And in the Americas, they are coming from Africa because it's pretty close. That's where the trade's going. And it's African tribes on the coast taking prisoners of African tribes on the interior. Remember, tribes fight with each other all the time. And then selling them to the Portuguese, later the British. In the 1650s or 60s, the British will sort of legalize and monetize the whole slave trade. And at that point, slaves will start to get less expensive. But they really push the racial aspect, the difference between black and white in this case. So there's really two major elements of slavery in America in particular. And one is there's an economic side. This happens to be where slaves are coming from. Slaves will get cheap enough for people, the rich people, to afford. And so from that standpoint, it'll generate this system. But there's also, again, a racial component where the leadership decides to really push this idea. And so if you think about in the colonies, in the southern colonies, there's rich farmers and there's, let's say, poor farmers, and then there's slaves at the bottom. Nobody wants to be at the bottom. All of these African people are slaves, or most of them, and they're at the bottom. And so now instead of a us rich versus them poor farmer, it's an us white farmer versus them poor slave kind of a situation. And so it's really a combination of these two elements that create the slave system that we have ultimately in the United States. And so we'll land back on slavery periodically as we go through this course. And so Bacon's Rebellion sort of brings this into focus, and the leadership uses that to really really make it set in stone at this point.